Hello and welcome to Algebra 101, your introduction to the rest of your mathematical lives. I hope you enjoy it. If you look up the definition of algebra in a dictionary or on this thing called the internet, you may get a few different answers, a few different interpretations, definitions. I like to boil it down to algebra means now math has letters in it. Yes, and those letters are called variables if you want to be technical. So a variable is basically like a mystery, it's a question mark. What is that number? But instead of using question marks, they use letters, and normally X is the most common letter. Well, yesterday we just started multiplying numbers together, and the X looks like the multiplication symbol. So if we did 7 times 8, you would hopefully know that that's 56. But now that we're into algebra or getting into algebra, you might look at that and say, does that mean multiply or is that a variable? Is that the letter X? And I got to figure out what number that is. So because of that, just like we said goodbye to this symbol the other day, instead of 8 divided by 2, now we write it as 8 divided by 2 as a fraction. We're going to say goodbye to the multiplication symbol. The X as a multiplication symbol will no longer be used. I'm sorry, X. It's been nice knowing you. You now have, it's kind of like Pokemon. It's evolved. The X does not mean multiply anymore. It's now a variable. It's all grown up. Okay, so if you want to say 8 times 7, how are we going to say that if we're not using the X? Well, there's a few different ways. You can use a dot, 8.7. That dot means multiply. I don't really like to use the dot because the dot's got to be like up off the bottom. If you accidentally write your dot down too low, now it looks like a decimal, 8.7. So why make things confusing? Why use a dot when we're already using a dot for something else? So I'm not going to use a dot very often. What I am going to use are parentheses. So if you see an 8 times 7 and you want to multiply them, at least one of them will be in a parenthesis. Sometimes both of them will be. Sometimes it'll only be the first one. But the point is, these all mean 8 times 7. This means that if you have something right next to a parenthesis and you don't see it written like this, it's not 8 plus 7 or 8 minus 7, this does not mean multiply. This is how you would write adding and subtracting. These don't have a plus or a minus in between them. It's a number right next to a parenthesis, or parentheses right next to another parenthesis. Those all mean multiply. That's what you're going to have to get used to seeing and recognizing that that means multiply. The answer to all these three are 56. All right, another way that we can represent multiply is with variables, with letters. And if the letters are right next to each other, for example, x, y. X, y means x is some number and y is some number, and we're multiplying them together. We're not adding them together. If we were adding x and y, it would be x plus y. The plus gets to stay. The plus doesn't evolve. It just stays a plus. It still means add. And same with subtract. Subtract does not evolve. It does not go away. So we don't have to make things more complicated by coming up with new symbols that mean add and subtract. Just multiply and divide. So if you don't see a plus or a minus in between your x and your y, or your a and your b, or your c and your q, whatever the letters may be, if there's nothing in between them, it means multiply. So what is it? How do we represent divide? With the fraction. So this would be x divided by y. So that's multiply, divide, add, subtract with variables. All right, and today's do section is going to be multiplying numbers together that are represented with variables, represented with letters. So let's go back to the xy. Say you get a problem that looks like this, xy. That's not really enough information to do anything with that. So there's going to be more information off to the side, and off to the side it'll tell you x equals 3 and y equals 4. or whatever. It'll make up some numbers. Now you know what x and y represent. Now you can replace x and y with 3 and 4. But if you just replace them like that, it looks like the number 34. 34 is not the answer. Remember, 2 letters next to each other means multiply. So this is actually 3 times 4. So instead of just writing 34, you either got to put a dot in between them, which you got to be careful with. Don't make it look like a decimal. I recommend using at least one parenthesis. That means 3 times 4, and now your answer is 12. So the multiplication itself is not going to be huge numbers. We're not getting into decimals and fractions yet. I just want to introduce you to substituting numbers in for variables, for letters. Your introduction to algebra. All right, now unfortunately, we also have to deal with negatives. So let's say x is negative 3, then you've got negative 3 times 4, which is negative 12. So this just goes back to yesterday's lesson. When you multiply 2 numbers together, if one of them is negative, your answer is negative. If they're both negative, you got to be careful on how you write this down. This looks like negative 3 minus 4. So if you want your 4 to be negative, you got to put the negative inside the parenthesis. Okay? So this would be negative 3 times negative 4. If you write it like this, negative 3 and negative 4, that's actually negative 3 minus 4. This is a subtraction problem. That's a multiplication problem. So algebra is like a language of math. So you're kind of learning a new language here. And just like the word 2 and 2 are spelt differently, they sound the same. Maybe that's a bad analogy, but this language can be messy as well. Like negative 3 minus 4, negative 3 minus 4 can mean 2 different things depending on where your parentheses are. So you got to get the understanding that if there's nothing in between your parentheses, it means multiply. If there is something between your parenthesis and your number, you follow what that says. It doesn't mean multiply, it means subtract. Okay, so it started here. It started with 2 letters right next to each other. It did not start like this. We're not subtracting. That would be a subtraction problem, but that's not what we have. We have a multiplication problem. We have 2 letters right next to each other. So you got to multiply here. So don't substitute in your numbers like this, because that means subtract. Substitute them in like that so you know to multiply. Okay, if that wasn't confusing enough, hopefully it wasn't too confusing. Hopefully you're with me and you're understanding this. Now it's about to get a little confusing. You could make these variables negative. So let's leave it at negative 3 and 4. And let's say this is negative, well, let me write it up here. Negative xy. Like I said, this is a language. So let's forget about the symbols and I'll write this out as a sentence. This is saying the negative of x times y. So this is a symbol for that sentence. The negative of x times y. It's a multiplication problem, but instead of just x times y, it's the negative of x times y. So when we substitute in x is already negative. It's negative 3. So this is like the negative of x. I think it's easier if you put x in its own parenthesis. Say the negative of x times y. What is x? X is negative 3. So it's the negative of negative 3 times y. We could substitute in for y right there too. Y is 4. So it's the negative of negative 3. If you take the negative of something, you're just switching its sign. All right, the negative is like the opposite. So the opposite of negative 3 is positive 3. 2 negatives in a row is a positive. Just like when we did 7 minus a negative 4 last week, that meant 7 plus 4. 2 negatives in a row makes a positive. So this is actually positive 3 times positive 4, which is positive 12. So even though we're substituting in a negative 3 and a positive 4, we're getting a positive answer. which is counterintuitive to what I taught you guys yesterday, but it's because we're substituting them in for letters called variables, and those variables might have a negative sign with them. All right, now what if the second one is supposed to be negative? What if y is supposed to be negative? So what if your problem is like this? We want to do x times the negative of y. X times the negative of y is not this. That's x minus y. That's a subtraction problem. So how do we represent x times the negative of y? You got to put the negative and the y inside the parentheses together. Now you've got x right next to a parenthesis. That means multiply. When you got something right next to a parenthesis, it means multiply, unless you see a plus or a minus there, which we don't. So this is x right next to a parenthesis. That means multiply. So x times the negative of y. That represents this sentence. Now, how do we solve that? We'll use the same x and y values. Well, we substitute in negative 3 for x, and x is just a regular x, so that stays negative 3. And we substitute in the negative of y. Well, y is 4, and we want to take the negative of 4. So now all of a sudden, we have negative 3 times negative 4, which is positive 12. All right, I think that's enough for one day. Your introduction to algebra got a little bit deep right here with the negative variable and the negative numbers kind of like canceling each other out almost. So you might have to refer back to this video when you're doing today's worksheet. I couldn't find a worksheet that had problems like this that I liked, so I just made up my own, and they're all like this. It's just two letters next to each other. You got to multiply them together. Some of them will be negative variables. Some of the numbers will be negative. So I know you know 3 times 4 is 12. I'm looking to see if you can figure out if it should be negative 12 or positive 12 in these problems today.